Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carl Falconer. I'm the CEO and president of Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance. First of all, thank you all for coming to our hard conversation today. I hope you've attended other ones, and hopefully you'll attend more in the future. We have a special guest with us today. His name is Ian De Jong. He comes to us from Canada. He is a world-renowned expert in homelessness, and in fact, now I can honestly say he has written the book on ending homelessness, which is actually his book, and we're going to be talking about that with him today. In addition to all of the world-renowned accolades I could give him about how great he is as a homeless advocate and researcher and just a fantastic resource in terms of homeless advocacy and data and information and things like that. He's just, honestly, just an all-around nice guy. I mean, he just is. He's a great guy, and you might expect that, you know, being he's from Canada. Everybody there, they tell me, is really, really nice. But he is genuinely a really nice guy, and I really appreciate him doing this with us and taking some time with us. So let me go ahead and jump into it. Before I ask you any specific questions about the book, I was wondering, for the benefits of those, unlike me, who have not read the book, if you could summarize some of the key points. Basically, kind of an elevator speech of how you would convince me by the time we got out of an elevator together that I should buy and read your book.
Thanks, Carl, and good afternoon to everybody here, and thanks for coming. I think that the book is essentially a synopsis of everything we know about ending homelessness up to now, from a certain perspective. And the perspective is one of a guy like myself who spends about 280 days a year on the road somewhere in the world working on ending homelessness. So what I tried to do is start with messages for the general public, really understanding what homelessness is, what it isn't, then move into what are the effective strategies where there's an actual evidentiary base to support doing certain work in a certain way, and then kind of tie up the book with information for elected officials, people in positions of influence, to think through how can they activate these strategies and put them into place. A lot of the book is based upon best practice. So for those people who work in homelessness or are interested in homelessness and wonder what works and what doesn't, it's really an amalgamation of everything that we know up to this point in time relative to implementation of best practice. And then what I do is I put a bit of an Ian spin on it. And the Ian spin on it is kind of a no holds barred, being blunt when necessary, being provocative as necessary, not as an intention to be in any way insulting to those people who do this work on a day-to-day basis, but rather to elevate the discourse relative to homelessness, to see it as a completely solvable yet complex issue.
Great, thank you. You highlight the fact that a big heart is not the same as a big brain. You specifically state, and I'm quoting from the book here, we need to stop tolerating people without training, serving people with complex needs. Your remedy is that case managers must have basic knowledge about certain things like trauma and assertive engagement and mental health first aid and so on and so forth. By my calculation, when I was reading it, I looked at it and I thought, it seems like it's about 2 weeks worth of training that a case manager would have to do before they actually even started engaging with clients. So my question is, how can cash-strapped, of course, social service agencies realistically accomplish this kind of training? And have you seen it done elsewhere?
I think there's a few responses that I could come up with relative to that question. It's a good one. Clearly, this is part of hard conversations. One is, as an industry, and we do work in a homelessness serving industry, and I think we need to highlight that, it is a profession, not a charity. It's not to say that there isn't a place for charitable goods and services, and not that there isn't a place for volunteerism. There absolutely is. But for those who are charged with the task of ending homelessness, one of the things that really elevates conversation in community after community is, if we want to manage homelessness, we need caretakers. If we want to end homelessness, then we need professionals with the skills and knowledge to be able to obtain that end result. Now, part of that, and part of the training that I outline in the book, there are some social work schools and human services diplomas that will cover that in the course of education. So when we think about hiring staff onto organizations, predominantly nonprofit organizations, one of the things that we can do to address the training needs is to start from a position of what are the core competencies we would want for someone applying for the position, so that we might mitigate some of those new training needs that come into place. But I'm also not so naive as to think that everybody who's going to work in this industry, which is essentially a very low pay, high demand industry, is necessarily going to come with degrees or the requisite training. And so this is where you really need a community strategy to go about addressing training needs. I wouldn't say it's the requirement of an individual nonprofit. I'd say it's the requirement of a community to say, what are the core standards, the core competencies that we want amongst everybody who's doing this work, and then raise ourselves up to that bar and that challenge. And to the latter question that you put out there around, how do you put this in practice with cash-strapped organizations? I really will come back to, another thing that I talk about in the book in different ways, which is we need to invest in change if we want to spend on impact. And investing in change is do what you always have done, you'll get what you've always got. You'll end up with homelessness into the thousands. You'll be in a position where you're wondering what's the next turn. People will look for flavor of the week solutions as opposed to looking very concretely at what is the core elements that need to be put in place at the individual worker level so that they are equipped with the skills necessary to achieve results. And one of the examples that I use quite frequently, I use a lot of medical examples when I train and when I do keynotes and to some degree in the book. But it's like if we had people with a health crisis, and if anybody in this room has ever been to an emergency room, we can be frustrated by the amount of time it takes to be seen by a physician, because you're going to be triaged relative to specific needs. And I think that's terrible. I mean, I don't think people should have to wait in emergency rooms, but I'm not a medical doctor, so you wouldn't want me to go practice medicine, even though I've watched, loads of Doogie Howser and ER and Grey's Anatomy. And I don't want people without the requisite training serving people who have probably just as complex, and in some instances even more complex needs, albeit not just medical needs, amongst the homeless population. So we really need to be thinking about what is the professional standard if we're going to achieve the change that we want to see within the homeless population.
Great, thank you. One of your most emphatic points is that ending homelessness is not about social control. It is about changing people's addresses from not having one to having one. The critique we hear in our community and in many others is that this is not enough. We need to address and this is quotes from the community, root causes of people's homelessness, or they will just become homeless again. How do you respond to that?
BS.
Beautiful, no, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think we know what that
I'll
is.
expand upon that. Here's one of the most remarkable things about homelessness in the general population is that they have more in common than they do apart, and that homelessness is actually a remarkably rare event. So some of the statistics that I point to on a regular basis, and I outline some of this in the book as well, is if we were to, for example, say that poverty is a root cause of homelessness, and in particular economic poverty amongst all the different types of poverty, I would say, how is it then that on any given night we'll have, I'll just say approximately 600,000 people experiencing homelessness on any given night in America, but we'll have about 45 million people living in poverty. Most people living in economic poverty are not going to experience homelessness. So it turns out that most people who are economically poor are housed and will stay housed for most of their, if not all of their life. Then people will point to things like, well, it's a substance use disorder, and if we don't address the substance use disorder, then people aren't going to stay housed. And I will say, again, the facts just aren't on your side. If we were to look at, rates of alcoholism and looking at data from SAMHSA, for example, we'd find about 7% of the population has an addiction or dependency on alcohol. Over 90% of people receive no treatment or counseling for their alcoholism. Almost all of them are housed. If we were to look at the use of other drugs, about 4% of the population, just under 90%, receive no treatment or counseling. So even most people with a substance use disorder are never getting treatment, and almost all of them are housed. Then people say, well, the root cause is, people aren't connected to mental health services, mental health treatment, behavioral health services. And I would say, greater connection is a good thing. But even if we were to look at rates of serious mental illness across the country, most people who live with a serious mental illness are housed. And it's, not an overly flattering statistic when you look at even the number of people living with the likes of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or major depression. Most of those people aren't well connected to services, and they stay housed all the time. And the list goes on. Most people with evictions are housed. Most people with poor credit histories are housed. Most people who have criminal or felony convictions are housed. So they just don't add up. So when I say, this is about getting people into housing and then addressing the core issues, as opposed to addressing the core issues and moving into housing. And the real opportunity that is presented with us in focusing on housing as the first step in the solution is the data is also really clear that if someone did want to more appropriately address a substance use disorder or their mental illness, the likelihood of them succeeding is much higher once they have stability of housing than it is trying to address those things prior to moving into housing. So give people a stable platform by which they can go about addressing the other major issues in their life.
Thank you. You do state that it is not enough to just house people, though. The objective should be to help them achieve a certain level of happiness. Does that not somewhat contradict your assertion that changing people is antithetical to ending homelessness?
So one of the pieces that's really important in the solution to people's homelessness is a connection to activity and connection to social and community integration. It's one of the 5 core principles of Housing First, social and community integration. And that social and community integration isn't just about creating social bonds, although those are very important, but can I live a satisfying, fulfilling life as opposed to just being warehoused in an apartment? Do I have those connections? Do I have a reason that I want to get out of bed in the morning, something to look forward to, something that's going to make me happy? And I think that we perhaps as a society have reached a point that happiness is for the privileged and the wealthy and not for those of lower income or those who experience homelessness. And I would say that if we look at even much of what we know around mental health recovery, having meaningful daily activities, having things that help promote happiness are so critical to that success. On a very personal note, which kind of weaves its way throughout my work, I mean, as someone who lives with mental illness, and in particular depression has been a huge factor in my life, I know that I'm in a better state of wellness when I'm connected to those things that provide me happiness. And to some that seems antithetical. Like how can you say that you live with depression and have a pursuit of happiness? And I will say it's probably one of the best antidotes to falling into a deep depression is having scheduled regular activities that do provide me joy. So on a personal level, I know it to be true as well.
So just as a quick follow-up for that, so I guess the way that I might try to describe it, and tell me if this is correct, is getting people into housing first, of course, is the answer to ending their homelessness, but keeping them in housing really has to do more with just keeping them in housing.
It does. I mean, it's yes, there's going to be the technocratic parts of keeping people housed. Is the rent paid? Are the lights on? Are they getting along well enough with neighbors and the landlord? I mean, those things following the lease. I mean, that stuff is technocratic. But I would suspect that most of the people in this room or in the future watching the video also can lay claim to feelings of home. And when a place that you live in makes the transition from it being walls and a roof over your head to a place that you actually feel belong and provides you comfort and makes you feel content. And I think that's all kind of linked into this notion of happiness, we are talking about more than just being out of the elements and having privacy and security. We're talking about a place where people have a connection to where they live, a place to call home.
Great, thank you. Since since mid 2016, we've been working on trying to address the problem of overrepresentation of persons of color, specifically African Americans, in the homeless population. You talk about this a little bit in your book. I would say I didn't think that you devoted as much space to it as I would probably have liked to have seen, and in fact, one of your most popular tools, the VI Spadat, has come under some scrutiny lately as not, I don't want to get this incorrect, but the assumption or the kind of what they're aiming at is they say that it may be helping perpetuate the systemic racism that's inherent in our homeless response system. So I'd like you to kind of address that a little.
I imagine the study that you're talking about is the C4 study.
Yes.
In particular.
Yes.
The C4 study is remarkably flawed methodologically in terms of how they combine data between individuals and families, the selection bias of the communities that they chose, and the conclusions that they reach are just not founded in the evidence. So there's a few things that I think are important to say that I want to state emphatically. One is the national data, as examined by the likes of the Policy Lab at UCLA, does not support the findings of the C4 study. In fact, it demonstrates that people of color, and not just African Americans, but also Asian Americans, Native Americans, et cetera, actually score much higher in acuity than people who would identify as Caucasian. The other thing that is interesting to note is even if you go back to the initial SPARK studies, the precursor to the C4 study, it also found that it was inconclusive in the community. So places like Maryland showed that there was absolutely no relationship between some of the conclusions that are reached in the C4 studies and what they purport to be potentially elements that reinforce a racist construct as systems of support. And I think it's also important for people to know the extent to which we design and test tools from a very particular framework to achieve the results we do. So as an organization, when we develop tools like the VI Spadat and the Spadat, first of all, we do it all with our own money. So there's no foundation money, there's no private money that comes into it, there's no government money, it's our creation. We give those tools for free. It costs us an exorbitant amount of money to develop and test and design those tools. And part of that testing process is we have the tool reviewed from an anti-oppression framework from independent outside people to provide us input and counsel on those elements of the tool that may be problematic from an anti-oppression framework, and then we address them. That's number one. The second thing that we do in the testing phase is we go to great lengths to engage with people who are experiencing homelessness to get their input on the tool. And in fact, the VI Spadat itself, with the exception of a handful of questions in there, are written, and we'll put air quotes because it's socialized, but written by people who are experiencing homelessness. And in our cohort of people, for example, on the upcoming version of VI Spadat, that'll soon to be released, more than 50% of the sample of people who were consulted who are homeless were African American. So we go to great lengths to make sure that there's strong representation from people lived experience, go to great lengths to make sure that there's really strong outside independent critique of the tool from that anti-oppression framework, and we go to great lengths to make sure that the tool does the things that it is actually established to do. Now, as we start to think about what does need to happen for our systems of care to be more focused on equity, I do think that there are some important lessons that we've learned in the process of VI Spadat, and some of which is also named in the C4 study, which is there are factors outside of the tool that influence the results that you can get from the tool. So things like, are the staff that are administering the tool representative of the populations that are served by the tool? Have communities thought through other biases in their process of coordinated entry that may be unduly influencing the results and the prioritization that comes from the tool? And are there factors that are bigger than the tool that may be influencing the results of the tool? So one of the things, for example, that they found I believe it was Iowa, it might be Idaho, let's say Iowa, when they were trying to unpack a bunch of the racial equity elements associated with the findings of the tool, what they actually found was the biggest issue was access to healthcare, and that the access to healthcare component was well outside the tool. It's that the healthcare services that were available to low and no income people in their community were absolutely biased against people of color. So when it came to actually asking people about their experience of using healthcare, it wasn't the tool's fault that people hadn't accessed healthcare. It's that the healthcare system had biases that were built into it that were interfering with people's access to those services. So I do think it's bigger than a tool. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and I was going to say that is one thing that I've heard you say many times before, and you reiterate that almost every training that you have is it is just a tool, and
Just a tool.
It has limitations. No
Yeah,
doubt.
it's remarkably imperfect. And by that, I mean that any sort of tool, whether it be a triage instrument or an assessment tool, it's going to have limitations. And those limitations in their application, I think sometimes, to be, well, blunt, is that we as systems of care can be lazy and put too much into a tool rather than looking at all the other pieces of our process that might need to influence that. And we have never suggested that things like the VI spit out are the be-all and end-all of what needs to happen in a coordinated entry process. It is just an instrument that can provide assistance. I mean, I'll go a step further, because one of the other things that the C4 study got wrong, and a number of communities get wrong, things like the VI spit out don't tell you what type of housing intervention to give people. They recommend that people be assessed for a certain type of housing intervention. And that's not just a subtle nuance, that is an absolute direction. But there are those who think, well, I scored 6 on the VI spit out, therefore I get rapid rehousing. No, if you scored 6, then you should be considered and assessed for rapid rehousing. It might be that that actually isn't the best intervention for you. And if we have an equity lens that gets applied to our prioritization criteria and assessment, in addition to the work that we try to do to make sure the tool is inclusive as possible, I think that we will end up in a position where we can start to better address some of the inequities that exist in our homeless service delivery system.
Thank you. You say that ancillary services in the homeless services world should only exist if they're helping us end homelessness. My question is, how can we tell? Well, and can you give us an example of a service that meets the test of ending homelessness and another that does not and should maybe either be reduced or eliminated?
How much time do we have? So let's talk about the positive ones. So the ones, the types of services that have a direct impact on assisting the work of ending homelessness. So I would say, for example, the provision of furniture to people once they get housed. Is that directly related to a service that is going to end someone's homelessness? One could say, well, no, I can't draw a straight line between giving you a bed and a couch and some dishes and your homelessness ended. But there's also a sufficient study and evaluation that showed that if people don't feel connected to the place that they live, which includes furnishings, that they're more likely going to leave. So a community might say, should we provide access to previously enjoyed, well-loved furniture to people once they move into housing? And I would say unequivocably yes, even though it's not the same as a case management service, it's not the same as a crisis intervention service, it's not the same as a sheltering service or those sorts of things. Another example where it can be positive or negative relates to provision of health services. So if that health service is trying to help people connect into what we might call more mainstream health services, in other words, more sustainable, ongoing access to health care, well, we're going to need people once they move into housing, in many instances, to be connected to health services, given the nature of their previous history and sometimes the complicating factors that come with the experience of homelessness itself. So that would be great. But if we just did, for example, healthcare to people while they're homeless and had no lens of sustainability or continuity into the housed realm, I would ask you, why are you doing it? It's more like providing the Band-Aid than it is providing the solution or the cure. But then there are a litany of other services that really have no place in the homelessness service realm, at least not while people are homeless. So some really good examples of that, things like life skills classes, budgeting classes, parenting classes, all of those would fall into the category of there's absolutely no point trying to teach people those skills while they're homeless. Those skills would be better applied once people move into housing. So if we're just delivering those sorts of services in shelters without having continuity, that would be, problematic. Another one that comes up, which could be a positive or negative, are employment services. Employment readiness programs are more or less problematic for the population that we aim to serve. So the resume writing, dress for success, interview preparation, those sorts of things. But if we actually took those same resources and said, we want to do supported employment rather than employment readiness, then that could be an ancillary service that actually makes sense, as opposed to continuing to perpetuate some of the issues of like lack of connection to employment. I mean, there's no shortage of employment programs, for example, in my travels where people say, we had 100 graduates of our employment readiness program. And I'll say, like, how many got a job? I don't want to talk about that, but we had a great graduation ceremony. And people felt really good about themselves. I'll say, that's not a bad thing. I mean, building self-esteem isn't a bad thing. But did it result in the outcome? Or was it just an output?
Well, and can you explain a little more about supported employment? Some people might not understand exactly what that is or kind of the concept behind it.
Yeah, so supported employment is different insofar as we really think about how do we get people connected to jobs and support them in jobs, which can even include a job developer or someone who actually is a job recruiter. So the difference really being, instead of saying, hey, Carl, we're going to work on your resume, we're going to do some mock interviews, then you're going to go pound the pavement and good luck. Could be in a position where it's like, I have a potential job opening at this greenhouse, and I have another potential job opening with this janitorial service, and another job opening at, Home Depot. And really, which one of those three do you think is going to be best for you? And then how do we support you to be successful in that? How do we provide resources and supports to the employer as well as the individual over a period of time? And so it's more about integration into employment opportunity as opposed to preparation for just going out and trying to find a job. So and that's it in a nutshell.
It's almost like employment first is to housing first, right? You get them employed.
Genius.
And then support them while they're there. Seems like a good idea.
Trademark that. That was
good. You may have heard that our governor has stepped into the homelessness space.
What?
Yes, you may have heard that. First with rhetoric and then with action in Austin, our neighbor to the south. He has dismantled encampments and created a state-sanctioned encampment now, and he and business leaders are calling for more shelter space. How does this fit or not fit within your approach of shelter as a process instead of a shelter as a space?
Wow, apparently hard conversations get harder as we go on.
That's the idea.
Yeah, well, shelters can be the most important instrument in ending homelessness when they do function as a process. The process by which we help youth and adults and families achieve housing as quickly as possible, and when shelters go to great lengths to make sure that any experience of homelessness is, in fact, going to be brief and non-recurring. And there are models of shelter provision throughout the nation that have achieved just that, where their lengths of stay go down, their exits to possible destinations go up, and they become just profoundly important instruments in the system as a whole. My fear, and Austin isn't alone in this category, is that sometimes there are those who want to create shelters to make sure that homelessness doesn't disrupt a perspective of what a quality of life should look like if you live in a city. So it's more of let's use shelters as an out of sight, out of mind, as opposed to a vehicle of ending homelessness. And that ends up warehousing people as opposed to serving people. I mean, one of the other things that evaluations in other communities have demonstrated to us is that the advancement or expansion of shelter services without a co-occurring expansion of housing is just going to beget more shelters as opposed to it being a solution. If we don't actually have enough opportunities for throughput, I mean, you could, in especially just about every metro area across the country, add several hundred, if not several thousand more shelter beds, and they would be filled up almost instantaneously. And that could be seen as a positive insofar as, if I'm a certain type of business that is got a storefront or street-facing kind of approach to my business, like a restaurant, those sorts of things, I would say fantastic. But the costs associated with that on an emotional level, as well as the costs of that on a financial level, are exorbitant. There will continue to be an escalation of costs over time because every single one of those shelter beds comes with an operating cost attached to it. And so what I think is short-sighted on the part of many business people who kind of champion more shelters, especially the ones that say, so we can get people out of the downtown and move them away so they're not seen, is they're the same sort of people, if we're going to paint types of people with a broad brush, to say, we want cost effectiveness in government. We want to make sure that we're getting really great return on investment. It seems, except when it comes to homelessness, in which case we're willing to spend tons of money and expect no great results if we're not going to put housing attached to it. And I just think it's missed economic opportunity for those people who we might serve, who might reintegrate into society, and it's also short-sighted insofar as we don't necessarily appreciate the mechanisms by which those sorts of measures are enforceable. I think we'll see that in a number of jurisdictions throughout the country. For those of you who are more involved in homelessness, you may, like me, be really looking forward to the conclusion of the Boise versus Martin case that's supposed to go to the Supreme Court, which is going to outline essentially what are the measures that can be taken with unsheltered homeless individuals in the country. I think that a lot of the eyes in the country are also focused on what might happen in California as a result of some of the statements that have been made at the highest level of elected officials around the state of homelessness in places like Los Angeles and San Francisco. And I also think that there's some tea leaves that can be read relative to where HUD might be going and the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness might be going relative to responses to unsheltered homelessness that we need to be paying attention to. So to your question, will this kind of sweeping of streets and having these massive shelters outside of urban downtown areas really achieve the objective of ending homelessness? My answer is going to be no. Might it provide people with an appearance that homelessness is reducing or ending? The answer is yes, but I think that it's only exponentially compounding human suffering by doing so.
Well, and just as a follow-up to that, you talk about in your book the 1 needs 6 rule, and can you expound on that a little bit, or kind of just tell everybody about that in your...
Sure. So 1 needs 6 is this idea that for every shelter bed that you create, you need to add 6 units of housing. And the analysis can look slightly different from community to community, but in the several dozen times we've done it, it keeps working out to around somewhere around 1 to 6. And what that essentially says is every shelter bed you want to have turnover in the course of a year. And so if you say that the length of stay for an individual in shelter is 60 days, and you look through the number of months in a year, then you say, okay, well, if that's a 2-month stay, that bed is going to turn over 6 times in the course of a year. The only way it's going to turn over is if people have a positive destination out of shelter, which we want it to be housing so that people actually have a permanent destination to realize at the conclusion of their homelessness. So if you had 1 shelter bed and you don't at the same time invest in expansion of 6 housing options, then you're not going to get turnover. And so that same shelter bed will be filled for a long time, if not quasi-permanently, by that individual, and your shelters will become de facto housing.
And just for those of you who are not aware or don't know the statistics here in Dallas, that would mean that we would need approximately, at this point, approximately 12,000 units of housing available for our 2,000 shelter beds. And that, again, it's not just 12,000 units, of any kind of housing. It's housing that's affordable, housing that's safe, housing that's secure, so that we can actually move people through our shelters here in Dallas, just for some, local perspective. Thank you. For years, I was a street outreach worker, as you know. We have many more street outreach workers in Dallas than we had just a few years ago. What we are still working on is getting street outreach right, though. What are some of the most effective and least effective models you've seen for street outreach, and how could we do more of being effective in that regard?
I love this question because I also did outreach in my life, and then so it's near and dear to my heart. I think that let's start with the least effective because that's more fun to talk about. So what you have to ask yourself, if you're delivering street outreach, what is the outcome that you're seeking? Not what are you doing, like not what's the output, not what's the activity, but the answer to the question of outreach is, so what? So what? So least effective is things like mobile, soup, soap, and salvation. And essentially, if I just meet your immediate needs without looking at the solution to your homelessness, I'm going to have to provide those same hygiene services every single day. I'm going to have to provide replacements for your sleeping bag or tarp or tent on a regular basis. And there is a fair amount of intentions of the giver rather than the receiver that goes into a lot of outreach services. So, whether that is evangelization and proselytizing, or whether that is, participation in a workshop or a club or a service group or, those sorts of things. There's a lot of expectation that goes on to people that doesn't get really good results over the long term. I mean, yes, it can keep people alive for a period of time. But if you're just focused on meeting immediate needs, one person today is 2 people next week, which is 4 people the week after that, which is, before you know it, that one person that you were just keeping alive has become 100 people that you're keeping alive outside, which then becomes 1,000 people that you're keeping alive. And you sit back and you say, as a community, homelessness is getting worse. And I would say that may be true, but homelessness is getting worse because your response to it at the street level was worse. That if you thought through, how do we have mobile professional services as opposed to a charitable approach to street outreach, we might get different results. And one of the other things that struck me, and perhaps it has you in your career as well, when you did street outreach, is, I could be a professional street outreach worker. I could have tons of training, educational experience, appropriate professional supervision, all of those measures that we might want to see put in place. And I could have worked with someone on the street for an hour today, trying to get them further ahead and moving towards connection to services and housing. And then, an hour or 2 later, comes a student group or a service club or a faith-based organization who think that they're qualified to go do street outreach. And, it's not just the provision of a sandwich or a juice box or a cup of coffee. And I always love it when they hand out granola bars, not realizing the oral health of most people experiencing homelessness would make that a really stupid idea. But anyway, the sentiment essentially says that, yeah, Ian, you might have been a professional street outreach worker, but we get to do street outreach too. And so if I'm engaging with the person experiencing homelessness, the messaging also gets quite confusing. The messaging essentially says, so when one person comes to talk to me, they're all about housing, and when another group comes to talk to me, they're all about, have a sandwich and sitting down and fellowship and those sorts of things. And I really think that again, if we go back to the idea of professionalizing the resources, and a big heart is not the same as a big brain, people who are unsheltered in many communities, again, the policy lab at UCLA analyzed the data that demonstrates this quite clearly, are severely more ill than the sheltered population and phenomenally more ill than the general population. So one factoid that really comes across, and I keep referencing this analysis done by the policy lab, the California policy lab at UCLA. So they looked at over 60,000 VI SPDAT records from across the country amongst sheltered and unsheltered people. And one of their stunning conclusions is that 50% of the unsheltered population is trimorbid, which means that they have a physical health issue, a mental health issue, and a substance use issue all happening at the exact same time. Right? That is a staggering statistic. That says that our unsheltered population is phenomenally unwell and at much greater risk of death. I would say we need to look at responses to street outreach that puts our most qualified, our most capable, and our most experienced staff onto the street. Because the other thing that I've certainly encountered in my career and travels, and I imagine other people in the room, if they've done street outreach, encountered this as well, we often see street outreach as entry-level positions into the home service delivery system. You know, so we need to like flip that on its head and actually say, well, if we actually have people who are more ill than the sheltered population, if we actually have people that are more service disconnected than the sheltered population, and we have people who still need a conclusion to their homelessness, I actually want the most trained people working the street. And so when you think about transformation in outreach services for any community, I think that there's a few things that we need to do remarkably well. One is we need to be really clear as to what's our objective of delivering street outreach. Is this about keeping people alive, or is it about keeping people alive plus ending their homelessness? Like the two can co-occur, but we need to actually mesh those strategically as opposed to accidentally. I think we need to ask ourselves, have we staffed this correctly? And have we funded the resources necessary to achieve that outcome? I am a fan of multidisciplinary outreach teams, so long as they don't become exclusive when it comes to information sharing with the rest of the system. So if you are going to like have a health orientation, you know, nurses, psychiatrists, those sorts of individuals who are providing services to people who are unsheltered, how do we integrate that with other services? And then the third thing that I think that we need to really see is strong metrics of expectation of accountability for the delivery of the service. If you're not getting people connected to the solution to their homelessness and street outreach, you're doing it wrong. If I just go and provide mobile generalist case management, what was the point?
Well, and one of the things in my time as a street outreach worker, and I think again this is some of what you're saying, but one of the things that I always thought about was the people who are not providing the housing-based street services. It seems to me that if they just redirected their efforts and actually did the same thing for people that were housed after they became housed, it could be very valuable to our system overall.
Sure,
and it could change the entire scope of what they're doing, whether it's meals or health services or whatever it is, the things that they want to do or the things they feel good about doing. If they did that for people that had just moved into housing, we could create maybe that sense of community you talked about.
Absolutely, and I would say there are a lot of different groups in community that want to do their best work to help people who experience homelessness. And I think that's a phenomenal amount of personal giving, time, energy, emotion to do that. But you know, and I had this conversation with a student group at a college not that long ago, who were doing out, and they had a remarkably structured mobile feeding program for people experiencing homelessness. And I was like, that's good. Better if it's connected to existing street outreach services. But if you really want to do something that's really impactful, one of the things that particular community struggled with is we had nobody who was preparing like welcome home kits for people once they achieved housing. You know, with the basic essentials. I mean, it's not just the furniture and those sorts of things we talked about before, but you think about like, so where do you get your cleaning supplies when you move into housing? Where do you get like your basic spices and food preparation items and, you know, toilet paper and light bulbs and garbage bags and those sorts of things? Like, you could take that same energy, actually put it in a box, And if you want the experience of actually engaging with someone who's been homeless, I mean, we could make that interface happen. That's not impossible. But that could actually provide exponentially greater value than, especially, I mean, this group, bless their hearts. I mean, you know, someone would be asleep and they would leave them like food laying around, and then I would go back a few hours later with the outreach team, and there would be like, clearly other groups have been there too, because someone is homeless asleep, and in one instance we counted 8 sandwiches, 6 juice boxes, and then a plethora of granola bars. And just like, you know, yes, the person probably need food, but did they need that? But all of you want to do the thing. And this time of year in particular, Carl, as I'm sure people are well aware, like, charitable giving is at a prime this time of year. Imagine if we could harness that energy and say, here's all the great things you could do throughout the year to not just serve the needs of people when they're homeless, but help people achieve the feeling and the experience of home.
Well, and let me segue that into another idea that you talk about in your book that many people might not be familiar with, which is placemaking.
Yes.
And talking about that in promoting housing stability. Can you talk about what that means and kind of, again, even in the same vein of this, how that might help do some of that placemaking?
Yeah, placemaking is this idea that we feel connection to places and spaces, not necessarily by accident, but through intentional activity. And part of the things we can do for things like placemaking is, I'll give you an example of a placemaking activity. Let's say you moved me into housing, so first of all, thank you. And you might have even provided furnishings, so I have a bed and a table and a chair and those good things. But it still may not feel like home. But then you come along and you say things like, here's a few picture frames. Put whatever you want in those picture frames. And one of the things that, you know, I would suspect most of the people in the audience it would have if I came to where you lived is there's probably artwork or photographs that you have displayed strategically in the place that you live as an example of placemaking. It's home because I want people to see this is my family, or this is a piece of artwork that moved me, or this was a collection of, you know, rocks or flowers or whatever that, you know, just I had a connection with. And those sorts of things have very personal value to people. So, you know, placemaking can be those personal touches that change a place from just being an apartment to a place to call home. And in turn, that is going to reduce recidivism of people that have moved into housing that return to homelessness, because we've increased that connectivity to the place that they're calling home. So placemaking, I mean, I don't go to it exhaustively in the book, but just I probably do more in training than I do in the book, but just this idea of the provision of housing is a phenomenally important good step, an important step, but helping that apartment make the transition on an emotional level to a place to call home is remarkably important.
Thank you. One interesting idea that you discuss in your book is a day center for housed individuals. Now, this is something, first of all, I have to admit, even in my years, I'd not heard of this. And I hadn't heard of this idea, and I wasn't really, I'm still kind of grappling with it in my mind as to whether I think it's a good idea or not. But I did have the question that, does this not contradict your idea, a little bit at least, of ancillary services existing if they help end homelessness? But again, maybe it comes back to housing stability of some kind, and maybe I just kind of missed that in that part.
Well, I spent a lot more time on the book talking about day services for people who are homeless than I do for those who have achieved housing. And I'd say day services for people who are housed fall into the categories of meaningful daily activities, that we really have to have an outlet for people to engage in things that will provide comfort and satisfaction and happiness, and that, you know, when we think about any sort of day service for people once they're housed, I think that we'll have to look at the broad continuum from those services that are designed specifically for people who might be more socially isolated, right through to more mainstream activities people can do during the day. But in terms of day services for people experiencing homelessness, I really don't want there just to be places that people hang out all day. I want them to be active and intentional. I want to make sure that we know people by name and that we have the opportunity to help those people move forward in their progression towards achieving housing. So, quick answer on that one.
And again, just for my edification, actually, so you're seeing a day center more as kind of a community center, if you think of it in terms of the housed population.
Yes.
As they see it as kind of a community center.
Yep.
Okay, great. You don't reference this specifically in your book, but I am curious, and we're obviously in Dallas. You may have heard that Houston has done a lot of work towards their ending homelessness, and in fact, some people would say, and I'll quote David on this one because he wrote this question, but Houston smokes us when it comes to ending homelessness. So my question to you, you've, I'm sure, looked at the research and looked at the what they've done and some of what we've done, and so just give me your thoughts on why that is that they're doing or have done so much better than us, and what we could do differently to kind of catch up to that. And please be gentle.
My immediate response to this one is the fallacy that competition is actually going to breed better results in ending homelessness. That, yeah, you might share the same state, and you might have some similarities, but homelessness in Dallas is homelessness in Dallas, and homelessness in Houston is homelessness in Houston. And that's also going to be different from Detroit and Los Angeles and Miami, and the list kind of goes on. I mean, people will point to some successful communities where success is measured as reduction, and say, we just have to do what they did. And we saw this a lot in particular, and we still see it to some degree, of communities that are working to end veterans homelessness throughout the country. But the conditions under which those reductions or completion of the task have been reached are so remarkably different. You don't have the exact same nonprofits that Houston has. You don't have the exact same leadership structure that Houston has. You don't have the same funding that Houston has. I mean, all those things, not to say that you couldn't pick up some referential points and say, oh, we could do this a little bit better, and Houston's actually not a bad model for looking at. But to say, let's take the Houston experience and transplant it and just put it into Dallas, I would say you're probably going to be more frustrated than you are anything else with that experience of doing that. That when we even look at evidence-informed and evidence-based practice in that application, is that, yeah, most of that can transcend geographic boundaries, but will always be subject to local conditions. And so when I would say you feel pressure to be more like Houston, or to do things more like Houston, or to achieve results more like Houston, I would say it has to come with a critical lens of what actually is applicable, what isn't applicable in this experience. Of that which is applicable, let's by all means figure out how to replicate it, but let's never lose sight of the fact that the people that we were serving are homeless in Dallas. They're not homeless in Houston.
Thank you. That makes me feel a little better. Thank you.
I'm all about
very
the
nice,
I'm
very
all
nice.
about the warm fuzzies.
Let me see. Your final piece of advice is to try new ideas and embrace risk-taking.
Yes.
What is the biggest risk that you have taken that panned out, and what's the biggest risk that you took that did not pan out? And how did you learn from both?
Oh.
I can start naming some of the things
Yeah.
if you want.
No.
Need some hints or okay.
I've got lots of risks that I've taken. I mean, when I was a direct service provider and leading direct service provision, some of the greatest risks that I took early on, and I'm talking like going back, to 2005 2005, 2006, was housing people directly from the street at a time when there was still a big push to say that the continuum model was the best approach, that you move from street to shelter, shelter to transitional, transitional to permanent. And we were like, well, to heck with shelters and transitional, let's just move people. And I'm talking about like people living in the woods and sleeping on grates and setting up in tent cities. And we're like, well, let's just house you and see what happens. And support you, obviously, afterwards. But, I mean, that was a risk. And it came with a lot of pushback from a lot of people who thought that that was the stupidest idea they'd ever heard, which kind of feeds back to an earlier question around, like, if you're not addressing the root causes, you're setting people up for failure. And I would say, you're right, because keeping people homeless longer is going to be so much more successful. Finally, some applause. All right, time to dig into the greatest hits. So, I mean, that was a huge risk. Going into consulting for me was a risk. I mean, I launched into consulting saying, like, I want to change the way that we think about and respond to homelessness, but I did it all without a business plan, which makes me like one of the crappiest consultants probably that ever existed. It's like, you know, I still remember having the conversation at home, and it's like, what are you going to do next? Well, I'm going to consult on homelessness, and you know, the response was, so who are your clients? I don't have any. How are we going to find them? I don't know. But just this dogged determination, and I mean, work finds me. I don't look for work. You know, another big risk was creating the SPDAT and the VI SPDAT. You know, that was long before coordinated entry was even talked about. It just this realizing that if we kept treating homelessness as a homogenous group rather than understanding the specific strengths and opportunities to build upon with each individual and family, then we were going to continue to just get what we've always got. So that was a huge risk. And now...
Something that didn't work out?
Yeah, no, I'm getting there. The first versions of the SPDAT were horrible. Absolutely catastrophically demoralizing in their incompetence, but persevering. Not understanding how best to go about supporting people in making the transition from homeless to housing. Made a lot of mistakes in that regard in the early stages. Not always engaging in conversation with community as opposed to just espousing evidence, that realizing that, you know, one of the biggest mistakes that I've made is in the early days of this sort of work that I'm doing now is I thought if you just show up and give people facts that they will just suddenly go, whoa, and then just be happy that a messenger showed up with information they didn't have and not fully appreciating that people need to process that information, they need to respond to that information, and that cognitive dissonance is alive and well. And then, you know, another, like, because the mistakes could take a lot longer, you know, another really big one that I'd say that I've made is not fully appreciating the importance of promoting policy that is going to make the system change. Because so much of my work was focused on just the front line or the nonprofit organization. And, you know, I think a big mistake that I certainly made in the past, and I still make sometimes, is that responses to homelessness exist in a system. And if we don't address systems, and if we don't promote and support leaders in those systems, it doesn't matter what you teach at the front line, the system isn't going to change.
Thank you. These hard conversations do not usually include breaking news, and we try not to be too inside baseball here, but what do you think of the appointment of Dr. Robert Marbut to head the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness? For those of you who don't know, he was just recently appointed as the executive director, and he comes from our home state here of San Antonio, leading the Haven of Hope in San Antonio previously.
It's a peculiar choice. Why? Marbut, in his consulting life, was a strong proponent of housing fourth, not housing first. He was a strong proponent of demonstrating behavioral change in order to achieve housing as a reward, with some punitive, and I might even go so far as to say draconian approaches to how that's achieved. Marbut, in his consulting world, at least in some of the communities where we also worked, had a very interesting spin on how to use statistics and facts that didn't necessarily align to the main currents of thought and practice and other evidentiary base that it was strongly adopted by others. I think that the appointment of Marbut to lead the USICH will come with some heavy lifting on his part. I mean, I did an interview with the LA Times earlier this week, so I'm going to basically repeat the same things I said there. He'll have a lot of work to do to restore faith amongst people who work in the homelessness service realm to move forward, given his track record relative to consulting work. It is entirely possible, and I certainly haven't had any discussions with him since he has been selected for the appointment. But I think the nation is owed some commentary on his thoughts on housing first, given that it's so strongly linked into the federal strategic plan to end homelessness. Does he agree or disagree with that? I mean, someone like Dr. Carson, who leads HUD, has made strong statements around believing and practicing housing first, and that isn't going away. And given that USICH is predominantly it's a coordinating body across different government departments and releasing of best practice and information, where does that leadership stand? Where does the federal strategic plan sit now? So I'd be very intrigued to know what that is, and I think that we'll need to hear that. I also would say that we need to know what his thoughts are relative to people who experience homelessness generally, because some of the language that he has been quoted using in the past is very much blaming the individual for their homelessness, as opposed to looking at factors that contributed to homelessness. And so I'd want to know what his stance is on people who are homeless. Does he embrace an approach that says that homeless individuals have more in common with people who are housed than not? Or does he see them as somehow less than other people who are housed? And I'd be very intrigued to know what the answers are to those questions.
All right, thank you. Let me see. Many communities know what needs to be done and know how to do it. Obviously, you outline a lot of those things in your book, and that's fantastic. I really appreciated that. What they lack, though, in many communities is political will. Earlier this week, the Dallas Morning News editorial board argued that Dallas is one of those cities that lacks the political will to do what it takes to end homelessness. How would you suggest, or how have you seen communities overcome this problem?
So political will is an interesting one for me because we often will see it as the will of just an elected official as opposed to the will of the people. So when it comes to political will, what it means in some communities is I want the mayor to say A, B, or C and provide funding for X, Y, and Z, and then we'll achieve conclusions, and that's what political will means. But political will in other communities means actually, yes, I need that at the capital P level, like the mayor and or governor sort of level. But political will can mean, can the executive leadership across nonprofits who serve people who are homeless, can they agree on what needs to happen and how it needs to happen? So is there a coalescing of vision and strategy and implementation that's happening there. And I will say that in my experience, sometimes you actually have very weak mayors, but strong political will at that executive leadership level within nonprofits who essentially said, we're going to drive the change. We're not going to wait for there to be a mayor or elected official who's going to champion this cause. And one of the places that I point to in my travels, it's the Big Island of Hawaii. They've reduced homelessness 51% over the last 3 years. But it didn't start with a mayor saying that we're going to reduce homelessness by 50% over 3 years. It started with local executive leadership saying, we're going to take the reins to figure out how to go about addressing homelessness differently. And then the capital P political will has been very supportive of that as an initiative of change, but it didn't start from that. So I see that as a positive example. But there certainly are other places where it did come with statements even made from senior elected officials that never translated operationally. I mean, there's lots of mayoral declarations that have happened over the past decade that says we're going to end homelessness, and then there was like fancy news stories that accompany that, and then the provider community was kind of left answering the question, so how exactly are we supposed to, like, we don't have the resources, we don't have the opportunity, we don't have anything that's necessary to help us achieve that aim. So I would say when it comes to political will, best if we do it twofold, but I would actually start with those people who have the privilege of holding executive leadership positions in front line to say that we can use our existing resources, our staffing, our facilities, we can use and lead a different approach to ending homelessness there, as opposed to waiting for what I think some communities do, and I'm not suggesting this is Dallas, but in some communities, it's almost like you're looking for permission from someone to be awesome. And I don't think you need permission to be awesome. I think you just own awesomeness, do it, and then you wait for other people to catch up.
Thank you. I think you just added to my to-do list right there. Thank you. The final question I have is somewhat
Thank
philosophical.
God, final question.
Yeah, final question. And then we'll get to the really tough questions in the audience if we have a little bit of time. The final question, though, I have is somewhat philosophical, and this is one that I actually asked David to put in on my behalf. You and I get paid because we have yet to end homelessness. We're trying to work ourselves out of a job, and we've talked about that. Still, I personally sometimes feel guilty being paid a good amount of money while those that I'm working to help are still out on the streets. How do you deal with that, or does that ever creep into your mind thinking about people that are still out there while we're getting paid to kind of try and solve this problem?
All the time. Think about it all the time. I took a pay cut going into consulting. And in part it's, returns back to I'm a lousy business person. So, I want to explain a little bit about my personal values and philosophy on that and then address it. So, Org Code, which is the outfit that I lead, we are a for-profit company that tries to make no money. And the only reason we're not a not-for-profit is because I couldn't stand the thought of having a board of directors. Because I have authority issues. But it doesn't mean that I can't operate a business from a very ethically sound perspective. So, when I think about, a few things that we're able to do, one, I very much believe strongly in ensuring that we continue to generate products that are of use to people who do this work on a day-to-day basis, and that we can give those things away as much as possible. So I believe strongly in that. I believe really strongly that our firm will do a set amount of pro bono work every single year. So when especially people in public service positions or national organizations or big organizations come calling and just want like some consulting advice on something, I'm not like other industries or even some other consultants in our industry to say, Yeah, I can give you the answer to that or advice, but I'm going to charge you by the minute for what that advice is. I just throw it out there. I mean, my blog, just constantly gives away what's in my thoughts and research and whatever all the time. I mean, even things like, writing a book. I mean, what people don't realize is that, I actually make very little off the book. Books, I mean, unless you're like a national bestseller, are like a really terrible strategy for making money. I will probably never recoup the number of hours it took to write the book and the sales from the book. So it's a giving exercise. But I have those moments, at least once every single day, where I realize that I do still get paid, that I am part of the homelessness serving industrial complex, that my ability to do my work is only made possible by the money that I receive to show up. And I sometimes balance this. God, this is a hard question. I sometimes balance this with what are the other things that I'm doing to make that possible? And again, on a personal level, I spend about 280 days a year on the road. And people sometimes push back and say, you must make tons of money if you spend that many days a year consulting. And I was like, it's not always paid. Some of those are travel days. And, what is the cost to you for spending 280 days away from your kids? I mean, I got 4 kids, and I really like 3 of them.
I thought you said yesterday at least 2.
Well, it changes day to day.
Okay. Just a second.
I mean, there are some days of the year that I really like all 4 of them. But just being in that position is like, that comes at a toll too. So what's the cost of that? And I would say that this would be an inauthentic journey for me if it was about wealth generation. There are definitely some people who work in this industry on a consulting perspective where they make like way more money than I do. And I don't begrudge them that, but I sometimes am thoughtful of, may I never lead down that road where the pursuit of ending homelessness becomes about personal wealth as opposed to making sure that individuals and families have a place to call home.
Thank you. Do we have time?
We have time, first of all, for the most important question.
How do you get the book?
How do you get the book?
That's right.
Do you mind if I hold this for a second?
No, go ahead.
So this is the book on ending homelessness right here. It's available in hard copy, soft cover, and electronically. The easiest way to get a hold of it is go to orgcode.com, orgcode.com, and click on Get the Book. Or you can go to the Org Code Facebook page where it's pinned at the top, and you can order the book. The publisher is Friesen Press. It'll take you to a direct link to order your copy of the book. And I know it's come up a few times this week is, do you have books with you? The short answer is no, but I want to explain. Because there's a box of books that is sitting beside my door at home so that I wouldn't forget them. Do you know what I did? Forgot them. And I was fully prepared to take them. I started my week in St. Louis. I'm finishing my week in Dallas. I was fully prepared to bring them with me, and I just absolutely forgot.
This might be why you think you're not going to make any money with the book.
Well, that's one of the problems. See again, also terrible business person. But I mean, let me also just say, relative to the books, if you as let's say there's an organization here in the room, and you said, we wanted to actually get a few copies of the book, or a number of copies for the book. It's way cheaper if you just reach out and email me, and then we can have them sent in bulk. We get a completely different price as the author of the book for bulk purchases than you putting it out individually. And before anybody freaks out about the cost of the book, I mean, just also to be really clear, I am making next to nothing on the book, so don't blame me for like, why is it $21.95? Because people smarter than me figure out that that's what the cost needs to be.
Great. Questions?
We've got 8 minutes, so if somebody has a burning question, they'll need to use the mic. All right, so come up to the mic. All right.
So there's a microphone over here, and there's a microphone over there.
Microphone over there, and if you can make sure to state it in the form of a question. Keep it to like 30 seconds.
Well, I got more for when I'm done. This was
The
vodka.
speaker.
I'm kidding. Please go ahead.
Okay, municipal leagues around the state, around the country, do you go and present to them at all?
I do. Thanks for the question. So I mainly do it when I'm invited to do so. I sometimes do it when there's an opportunity to do so, when I'm in a community and there's just a door that opens. But in terms of my work with different municipal leaders, there's a fair amount of presentations, for example, that I've made to city councils, to mayor's offices and their staffs. So I do a fair amount of that work as well. But I also can't guarantee that presentations or communication outward is received. And I have no control over the message reception, but yes, I do that. Over here.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm a faculty from TW Dallas campus. I would just like to know, is there a better strategy or plan, advice we can incorporate this homeless, bring the student in higher education about the, increase their awareness of the homeless? Thank you.
Yes, great question. In terms of what can we be doing for those, especially at that level of their education? Because I think, just to preface the question before, I think, exposure to homelessness for grade schoolers and high school students is one thing, but once we get to higher education, like there's no, while some universities offer courses that work to address homelessness, there's no like degree per se in homelessness that you can get, or homeless services. So it's usually, some public health courses, some nursing courses, some social work courses, some social policy courses, some social planning courses. Maybe, you kind of look across a number of different disciplines and you put it together. So the experience, I think, has to be one of two things. How do we create meaningful internships for students at a policy level, so that they can actually see what the policy mechanics look like when you're dealing with a complex social issue, because it's not necessarily, as I understand it, as straightforward as policy development in some other areas. And I've done policy development in this realm, but I haven't done policy development in other areas. And the second thing is, how do we create opportunities for field experience that give those students credits for actually serving and engaging people who are experiencing homelessness, as opposed to me observing someone serving someone experiencing homelessness. And I would say that there are some organizations at that kind of nonprofit level that can form more strategic partnerships with places like your school, that will allow for the sort of not just direct supervision in terms of were you safe, but also getting into the critical thought elements. And what I really found is to be helpful is having even a joint reading list through the field experience, usually 2 or 3 journal articles or books that we want people to read. And so you can actually have that supervisor to intern conversation in their field experience that is putting their experience into a broader theoretical base, and then encouraging their critical thought in doing it. I also think that some sort of reflection paper at the end of that term, so it wasn't just you got the credits because you went out and did field experience for so many hours per week, but rather can you demonstrate that you can anchor your thoughts into the literature that's related to homelessness. Those would be my thoughts on that.
Hi, I'm Dave from Allen, Texas. Just one question that I didn't get the full answer was when he asked you what's the most risk you took to help them, and you mentioned moving them from homeless to permanent housing. Am I right?
Yeah.
And so what were the results?
So the results were phenomenal. Over 90% of the people that we made the transition with had stayed housed by the end of my tenure. But we had a rocky start because we didn't know exactly what supports looked like. And we didn't know what the investment in supports needed to look like relative to staffing as well as financial resources to provide assistance to people. So we got a lot wrong in the early stages of moving people directly from living outside into housing. Big risk, but we achieved success over the long term.
I was going to say there was no org code training available for you then.
We were making it up as we went along.
Ladies and gentlemen, and then we'll let you.
Okay.
Would you address the importance or lack of importance of homelessness and pet ownership?
Great question. So there's actually not a lot of evidence and research done on this, but that which has been done would show that about 20% of the unsheltered population has an animal. And that the majority of those, and I can only draw upon a handful of places like San Francisco, Las Vegas, there's one other place in Florida, but can't remember off the top of my head, where they've done more in-depth surveys with people. And the majority of those who said that the majority of those who had a pet, not a service animal, but a pet, would refuse shelter under all circumstances if it meant separation from their pet. So as a result of that, what we're seeing, especially in reconfigurations of existing homeless facilities, is the expansion of kennels and places for animals to come into those facilities to allow for connection between the pet, whether you want to call it owner, parent, whatever, and the actual pet. And we're actually seeing a number of things. So, for example, one of the shelters we worked with in Orange County, California, they were adamantly opposed. We are not having any pets come into our facility. And I kept saying, like, if you're going to be low barrier, if you really want people who are very vulnerable who have pets to come into your facility, you're now going to need to have pets. And then they said, okay, we'll try it. And they said it's the best experience we ever had. Because people tend to be much calmer when they have their animal with them. They were worried about things like animals biting people and, those sorts of things. I was like, have you ever worked in a family shelter? Like, little people bite each other. So if your fear is biting, don't serve families. But the expansion of that has turned out to be great. Another facility that's being built in Sonoma County, California, part of their design right from the very beginning is pet-friendly spaces. So I think we can do a great job of ensuring that vulnerable people who have pets are welcome in the facilities where they can be served. You're welcome. Last question.
Yeah, thank you for your work. Thank you for being here today. It's been very helpful. I volunteer at a wonderful community center in South Dallas. Shout out to Masjid al-Islam. And we feed the unsheltered and the food poor in South Dallas on weekend days. We give them breakfast and lunch. What you said about the comorbidities of the homeless population is spot on. You will typically find people who have some combination of maybe mental illness, alcohol or drug addiction, PTSD, a lot of veterans, and things like that. There's also, it's a violent place to be. Yeah. I've had people come in and open their shirts and show me multiple bullet holes or places where they had been stabbed. We had a guy come into the shelter who passed out when he walked in, wonderful old man, Latino man, who'd just been mugged on the street. It's not a safe place to be.
Yeah.
People that have that in that population, a lot of those with the comorbidities, there's going to be a very complex transition period for them because, there's some serious mental health issues. You've also got problems with, criminal past that get in the way and things like that. How do you envision that transition taking place?
Yeah, what a great question in terms of this idea of making the transition from homelessness to housing. So one of the things that I've talked about
at length in other environments and go to some degree of touching on in the book, is this idea of when you have someone who's been chronically homeless in particular, and that's much of what you're just describing as people who've experienced chronic homelessness, when they move into housing, we're actually asking them to do something completely abnormal, right? We're actually saying, you were surviving, some people even thriving, even with all the conditions that you were describing in your homelessness. And I'm asking you to leave all that behind and go into a place where now you're gonna have to pay rent and follow a different prescription of rules with the lease, and not just rely upon food programs like you describe, but like maintaining your own food security, etc. Most people need a lot of supports to make that transition. For a lot of individuals, that doesn't happen overnight. You might get me an apartment, and wouldn't it be great if I spent 2 or 3 nights in my apartment this week, and next week maybe I get to 3 or 4 nights? But staying in my apartment might mean like sleeping on my balcony or on my floor because I'm still not used to sleeping in a bed. And then for a lot of people, the social supports that they receive when they're homeless, as imperfect as they might be, I also can find myself distanced from that. So many people, when they make the transition from homelessness to housing, actually have to grieve their homelessness. They have to work through a process of letting it go and coming to a place where there's a new normal in their life. And I think that that transition comes with those professional supports that are in place, those volunteer supports and community-based resources that can continue to be of value to people. They also stem from our ability to process with people their emotional experiences of the transition. So it's not just the technocratic things like take out the trash, clean up the apartment, make a meal, but how are you feeling about this transition? And then also appreciating that for some people, their first foray into housing is not going to be successful by standards of did you stay there. So the measure of success is really got to be, did you stay housed over the long term, not did you stay housed in the first place you moved. That's what I feel.
And I have to say, just to kind of close on that kind of note, one of Ian's successes, which I've heard him talk about several times, is one of his claims to fame when he was a direct service provider is rehousing an individual 13 times throughout their program and realizing that that was success. Success for him was not giving up on that individual. Ooh, I'm going to get emotional now.
Yeah.
Not giving up on that individual and really seeing them through until they were ready to finally stick in that one place where they could finally stay. So I want to say thank you to Ian. I want to say thank you to all of you. Please make sure you get the book. And thank you for coming to the Hard Conversation.